Openings are one of Hikaru Nakamura's strongest weapons. He forces his opponents into positions that they aren't used to by using a lot of unorthodox styles and opening variations, gaining an advantage straight from the start. In this video we will look at those openings and I will help you gain an understanding on how to play them the way Hikaru does. First opening we will take a look at is the Yoko Piano. Translated, this means the silent game. It's really similar to the Rui Lopez, where both teams' main priority is to fight for center control. It starts off with white going e4 and black responding with e5. White will push his knight out to f3 and black will respond by going knight to c6. Now instead of going bishop b5 like the Rui Lopez, you push your bishop to c4, starting to put pressure on this f7 square. White will respond by going bishop to c5, keeping the game super symmetrical. On the next move, white will move c3. Black's best move right now is to move knight f6 and put pressure on this e4 square. Now the idea white will go for right now is to sacrifice this pawn and immediately push d4. Black will take with his e pawn and you immediately take with your c pawn, continuing to put pressure on this bishop. Black's best move is to go bishop b4, checking the king. Move your knight to c3, blocking the check, allowing black to take e4. Immediately get your king out of the way by castling kingside. Now there's one of two main ways to go from here. It all depends if black takes with the bishop or the knight. If black chooses to take with the knight first, capture it with the pawn. Black will most likely take the pawn, threatening this rook. Now move queen to b3, initiating a trap. If black takes your rook, you can immediately push f7, checking the king, forcing him to move f8, threatening the queen with your next move by going bishop to g5, leaving him only one option by defending with the knight. And your next move will be rook to e1, putting more pressure on this knight, guaranteeing that you will win the queen in the next move. The second line is if black takes with the bishop first. Don't immediately recapture with the pawn. You're going to want to focus on developing your pieces and gaining position. Move d5, giving black a choice. Does he want to lose a knight or the bishop? Most likely he will choose to sacrifice a knight and go bishop to f6. But again, don't immediately take. Move rook to e1, putting this knight to the king and asking a question again, which of the two knights does he want to lose? Now the best play for black right now is to not lose the knight on the e file because it leaves the king open. So the best move is to go knight to e7, and only after he does that move you take with the rook. Now white is a pawn down, but his pieces are a lot more developed and he's gained a lot more position. I mean, just look at black's pieces and how cramped they are. All of them are on the last 3 rows of the chessboard. This is the end of this opening. Remember, don't rush into taking the pieces. Focus on building your position and developing your pieces before you rush into taking any of black's minor pieces. Now, let's start with the Groenveld. The whole idea of this opening is to give up your center and initiate an attack on it with all your minor pieces, forcing white to defend. So if white does not defend properly, you're going to retake the center and gain massive positional and tactical advantages. It starts off with white going d4. Instead of pushing one of your center squares, go knight f6. White will immediately take the center by going c4, and again instead of pushing one of your center squares, you go g6, setting up the bishop to go g7 and helping to get your king out of the center as fast as possible by opening up the kingside castle. White will further develop his pieces by going knight c3, and only after he moves his knight you go d5, starting to put some pressure on the middle of the board. White will most likely take your d5 pawn, which you recapture with the knight. Now the best move for white is not to capture with the knight, but actually push e4, securing the center. So remember, black's plan is not to take the center, but to recapture it after white has initially secured it. So take knight c3 and white will respond by taking your knight with the pawn. Now after white has achieved this position, black will want to start putting massive pressure on this d4 square. First, by moving his bishop to g7, white will continue his development by going bishop to c4, putting some pressure on this f7 square. Now for this attack to work properly, get your king out of the way first and castle kingside. White will further develop his minor pieces by going either knight to f3 or knight to e2. Now with black's next move, you're gonna ask him a question. By going c5, if he chooses to take, you can immediately trade queens, stopping white from ever being able to castle, to leave black with major positional advantages. If he chooses to castle first, still don't take the d4 pawn, trapping white into double upping his pawns if he takes on c5. The best move for white is actually going bishop to e3, further defending this d4 pawn. And black's next move will be queen to c7, x-raying this bishop. where if white makes a sloppy move like putting his rook on his open b file, you can start initiating a series of trades. When you take this d pawn and white is forced to recapture it with his pawn, you can take off the knight, force him to take off the bishop, and end up being a pawn up and putting major pressure on all of black's minor pieces. Now let's get into the queen's gambit decline. After white goes d4 and black responds with d5, white will initiate the queen's gambit by going c4. Black will decline by going e6, and white will further his development by going knight c3, in which black responds by going knight f6. Both sides initiating attacks on the center with their knights and their queens. White's best move is further securing his d4 pawn by going knight f3, and black will choose to defend a possible pin if white chooses to go bishop to g5, securing both his knight and his kingside pawns, opening up the kingside castle. The best move for white right now is by going e3, opening up his bishop. Now black will ask white the question on his next move by going h6. You will either have to trade his bishop for your knight or push him to safety by going h4. Now black's main plan right now is to open up his light square bishop. So by moving b6, on the next move you can either put your bishop on the b7 or the a6 square, getting really good diagonals on the board. Now after white goes bishop to d3, you have one of two main lines you can start attacking. One is called the Lasker's defense. This is where you push your knight to e4, forcing white to trade bishops. Now this might look like you're sacrificing a pawn. After white chooses to take your e4 pawn, you can immediately regain it by moving your queen to b4. And depending on how white chooses to defend this position, you can either gain his c4 or his b2 pawn. The second and more commonly played variation is after white goes bishop to d3, you move your own light square bishop to b7, getting ready to open up this diagonal for the bishop. After white castles, you immediately take the c4 pawn, forcing white to move his bishop again, making the first move pretty much useless. This is called gaining a tempo on a piece, opening up a really good line for the bishop, making it one of your strongest pieces on the board. These three openings are some of Hikaru's most used openings. He has used the Queen's Gambit decline in 116 professional games alone, and have used the Gyoko piano to beat former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. Thanks for watching everyone, please leave a like and sub to my channel. Let's try to hit that 100 subscriber mark.